The Castillo de San Marcos sits at the middle of the historical city of St. Augustine in Florida. To many who travel through this beach town, it is a cool stone fort and nothing more. Nevertheless, this idol building has one of the most incredible stories that can be told. The city of St. Augustine was founded in the year 1565 on the fringe of the Spanish Empire. The town served as a naval base and resting spot for the Spanish treasure ships following the Gulf Stream north from the Caribbean and back to Spain. St. Augustine thus became an essential trading post for sailors and a commercial center. This led the famous Sir Francis Drake of England to raid and burn the city in 1586. While the Spanish first constructed several wooden forts to protect the settlement, they proved ineffective when another famous English captain, Robert Cecil, raided and burned the town to the ground in 1668. After discovering that wooden forts are, in fact, very bad against fire, the Spanish crown got serious and commissioned the building of a large stone fort. Over the next 23 years, a particular type of stone called coquina was mined from the nearby Anastasia Island. This stone was chosen for its composition of limestone and seashells, which provided a very sturdy structure. The fort was finished in the year 1695 and rivaled some of the forts built in Europe. The people who built this fort consisted of Native Americans that lived and worked in the nearby Spanish missions, laborers from Cuba that were both skilled and unskilled, and skilled designers from Spain. The fort had 4 points or bastions and was built to allow interlocking fields of fire. Additionally, the ground outside the fort was built up, which helped to shield the walls from cannon fire. There was also a moat surrounding the fort that could be filled with water or be drained. Additional renovations in 1738 allowed for the deployment of cannons on the walls and not just on the bastions, and the ceilings inside were raised. The British would siege the fort twice, once during Queen Anne's War. This saw a British fleet attack the town of St. Augustine. 1,500 of the town's residents and soldiers held out till a Spanish force was able to relieve the siege. While the fort held out and served its purpose, the town was burned to the ground. Eventually, the British were defeated, and they had to march overland back to the Carolina colony. The second time the fort was sieged was during the War of Jenkins' Ear. This war literally started because a Spanish officer cut the ear off of a man whose name was Jenkins. Jenkins proceeded to report this to the authorities, and they proceeded to declare war over an ear. This time, James Oglethorpe led a British force in attacking the fort. They were not able to break through the walls after 27 days of trying because they were built with the sturdy coquina stone, and they were once again forced to retreat because of a Spanish attack. The fort would then go on to be occupied by the British after the Treaty of Paris in 1763, then reoccupied by the Spanish at the conclusion of the American Revolution, and then taken over by the American military with the signing of the Adams-Onis Treaty. The fort was then renamed to Fort Marion to honor the Revolutionary War hero Francis Marion, and was maintained as a military prison during the Second Seminole War. There are many stories about this time in the fort's life, but in the interest of time, they'll be left out for a different video that I have planned about the Seminole Wars in Florida. The fort changed hands once again in 1861 when the Confederacy occupied it for a little less than a year, which then fell back into the hands of the Union forces, who literally just sailed down there and got the fort to surrender. For the rest of the fort's lifespan, it was once again used as a military prison for the Native American prisoners taken in the various wars the United States fought in the center of the nation in the late 19th century. Again, there are tons of stories about this time period that I will go over in a more in-depth video when I cover the Plains Wars in the United States' history. Its final use was to hold 200 deserters from the Spanish-American War, a war that I covered here on the channel. By the year 1900, the fort was taken off the active list of bases and became a national monument for the National Park Service in 1924. The final significant development in the story of this fort was its name being changed back to the Castillo de San Marcos to honor its Spanish heritage in the year 1942. Having been finished in 1695, the Castillo de San Marcos is the oldest brick and mortar fort that is located in the United States and has served 4 different nations as a powerful symbol of military power. Today, you can visit the fort like I did, since it is a national park. I highly suggest going and visiting it in person since there are so many stories to read and experience that I could not put in this video. Fort James Jackson, otherwise known as Old Fort Jackson, is the oldest surviving brick fort in the state of Georgia. Having been built in 1811 to provide defense for the port city of Savannah along the Savannah River, Old Fort Jackson was a small brick fort that saw some action during the American Civil War. The fort had a small garrison during the War of 1812 that was meant to protect Savannah from a British attack, but the fort never saw any action. Fort Jackson was part of a three-fort defense system that protected the vital town of Savannah in the state of Georgia. After the fall of Fort Pulaski to the Union forces in 1862, Fort Jackson served as the first line of defense from invasion by the sea. It was placed strategically in the Savannah River to prevent ships from maneuvering and allow the fort's guns to unleash brutal broadside attacks that would destroy them. The fort was manned primarily by volunteer units from the nearby city of Savannah. Fort Jackson also served as a naval base for the Confederate Navy. Among smaller wooden ships, the famous ironclad the CSS Georgia was anchored nearby as a floating battery that would block the river and support Fort Jackson. The status quo lasted from 1862 up until mid-1864, when General William Tecumseh Sherman ended his famous march to the sea with the capture of Savannah. The defenders were heavily demoralized and faced extremely overwhelming odds. The forces elected to abandon the fort, and the crew of the Georgia decided to scuttle the ship, and both forces retreated. The fort was then occupied by the Union and was garrisoned until the end of the Civil War. Eventually, in 1905, the U.S. War Department abandoned the fort and the state of Georgia took control of it. In 1865, it was reopened as a museum and was left open for 10 more years before the Coastal Heritage Society, a non-profit, took control of the site. Since 1976, the non-profit has operated the fort as a museum and has preserved many other historical sites and museums in and around the Savannah area to categorize the city's history. With the conclusion of the War of 1812, President James Madison began to overhaul the military of the United States. One of his most important priorities was building an entirely new coastal defense system to prevent the United States from being invaded again, exactly what was seen during the War of 1812. After years of planning, construction began in 1829 on a new fort at the mouth of the Savannah River. It was being directed by the U.S. military, and in this design team was a certain person by the name of Robert E. Lee, who had recently graduated from West Point. The fort was placed at the mouth of the Savannah River and had excellent defensive prospects. The walls were made 11 feet thick and were at a point where the smoothbore cannons of the time would be ineffective against the walls. The fort was finished in 1847, and upon its completion, Robert E. Lee remarked, "One might as well bombard the Rocky Mountains as Fort Pulaski." Remember this quote in the future. Upon its creation, the town of Savannah, Georgia, one of the largest ports in the South, was now considered protected from the sea. The fort was named after Casimir Pulaski, a Polish horseman that fought alongside George Washington and died in the Revolutionary War. He is not only saved the life of George Washington, but was also considered the father of the American Cavalry Force, a legend that deserved a fort being named after him. The fort was not manned until a Confederate force occupied it during the beginning of the Civil War. The Confederate forces decided to station forces there rather than garrison the nearby Tybee Island, since it was considered too isolated to pose a threat, and because the walls of Fort Pulaski were solid and seen as impossible to break through. They gave up Tybee Island to Union forces in late 1861. From there, the Union fortified the island and prepared for an assault on the fort. At this moment, I want to take a moment to talk about rifling. Rifling is the process of making grooves in the barrel of a gun or cannon that causes the bullet, cannonball, or shell to spin. This provides extra damage, range, and increased impact of the munition. The predecessor to these were smoothbore weapons, such as the smoothbore cannon or musket. One of the reasons the Americans won the Revolutionary War was that they used the Kentucky long rifle which had a long range of 300 yards compared to the British-bound Bess musket, which had around 75 yards of accuracy. By the time of the American Civil War, rifles had been widely adopted and became more widespread. The only thing that had not been tried was a rifled cannon. Well, in 1859, 2 years before the war, the American government had secretly been experimenting with one. It just so happens that this rifled cannon was brought to Tybee Island, the island that was said to be too isolated to pose a threat to the fort. The Union forces asked Confederate Colonel Charles H. Olmsted to surrender his fort. Olmsted was confident he could hold against any bombardment, and even more so against a land attack, and refused the offer. A 30-hour bombardment occurred and proved ineffective until a rifled cannon opened fire and smashed through the walls of the fort and nearly detonated a magazine. Seeing this and understanding how outmatched he was, Olmsted surrendered the fort. In one barrage, all brick-and-mortar forts were made obsolete, and only 2 people were injured in the fighting. Once the Union took control of the fort, it became an essential stop for the Underground Railroad, and all shipping in and out of Savannah, one of the South's most important points at the time, was stopped entirely, which meant the Anaconda Plan was able to start to take effect. It was used as a military prison for the rest of the war, and eventually turned over to the National Park Service in 1933. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed and want to see more of these on-location videos, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and have an amazing day. See you in the next episode.